Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Mladen Jovanovic. Mladen is a physical preparation coach from Belgrade, Serbia. He has held positions as a strength and conditioning coach and data scientist for Port Adelaide Football Club in Australia and is a football physiologist for Aspire Academy in Qatar. He is currently completing his PhD in sports science at the University of Belgrade. I've been following Mladen's work for a while and admire his ability to zoom in to micro-level ideas like periodization and interval training, and also zoom out to macro-level concepts like heuristics, risk mitigation, and complexity. Mladen is both a researcher and a coach who continually looks for ways to validate his methodology objectively, while also acknowledging the extent to which he's guessing and tinkering. He's a scientist who's skeptical of scientism. This season, I purposely didn't release any recorded episodes until I finished interviewing all the guests, because I wanted to see if any concepts emerged that made it easier to organize the sequence of episodes thematically. I decided to open the season with Mladen's episode because his explanation of the small and large world that you'll soon hear about gets to the heart of what it is that coaches, teachers, medical providers, and performance managers are trying to accomplish. In other words, how do we manipulate our artificial training or learning environment to prepare ourselves for the chaotic, unpredictable world we encounter in things like sport, medicine, rescue, and military and law enforcement? Mladen discusses how we manage the small and large world conceptually and statistically, while the other guests discuss how the worlds coalesce in specific areas like football, martial arts, tactical shooting, mountaineering, nutrition, education, and medicine. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Without further delay, here's Mladen Jovanovic. Mladen, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. So I wanted to begin by asking you, I saw an Instagram post where you said that your coaching and teaching philosophy is derived from Machiavelli's The Prince. So would you start by explaining that? Because I thought that was interesting.
I think that was a funny. So it was me being a joker and a provocateur a little bit because I got fed up, to be honest, with all this touchy-feely culture first, athlete first, readiness first type of management. And anyone working in pro sports notice or knows that things are not really that clear cut and naive, if that makes sense. So, and by naive, I think on multiple things. For example, just because you know stuff or you have a PhD or you do collect the data, it doesn't necessarily imply that the coach will actually listen to you or the athletes will listen to you or give you honest feedback. So I think that this naivete is normal for someone entering the field or finishing the college, getting a degree, and then they are full of knowledge and full of optimism. They come in a club or professional settings, and they notice that no one gives a shit about what they're doing, the monitoring and the nice charts they're making. So at the end of the day, you do need to become more. You do need to realize that the athletes are not the rational agents. Like, not athletes, humans are not the completely rational agents. They're a lot of irrational in their behavior. So we do need to take that into account. And I think the analogy or example by using Machiavellian or Machiavellianism is to be able to be a little bit sneaky with the good intentions to sneak in certain stuff in terms of maybe withholding certain feedback or lying. So there's a I think big body of research and big body of evidence that lying or giving a false feedback might improve performance. So I do believe we do need to transparent with some of the, strategies in, monitoring and all this stuff, but we do need to watch out, for multiple reasons. And one is, for example, I'll give a few examples. So in the club I used to work with, we had a discussion regarding using a semaphore lights in terms of red, yellow, and green in terms of, I would say, the athlete status. So if someone is at risk or someone is, to be concerned, and the information could come from multiple sources. So it could be from a medical team, from a rehab, from, GPS monitoring and so forth. So we wanted to summarize it with the lights. So the discussion was, should the athletes know those indicators or lights? And, in the ideal scenario, you want the athletes to actually know what's being analyzed and what's going to happen. So imagine you have your athlete walking in the club and sees that he's red. So it's like, I'm at risk. Like, why am I at risk? So, how that's going to affect his performance. So it could be also the self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can plant the worm in his head that, there's something wrong with him, or maybe his mechanics or training load or whatever. And that may actually increase the risk of, whatever, getting injured or, maybe getting sore throat or whatever. And then it can also give him an easy way out. So, for example, if he had a bad game, or he doesn't push in a game, doesn't risk, then he might say, yeah, but you told me I was red. So they have a backup plan. So things like that, I think we do need to take into account. So we cannot be very naive in that regard. And I always remember my first professional job in Football Club Rad. So I was so scared the first time I went out on the pitch. There was 30 athletes I didn't know, and I had to take them for a warm up. And there was like news reporters and everyone, and I was freaking out. And the goalkeeper coach was, really supportive. He's like, chill the fuck down and, do what you do best. And the physiotherapist, who's, I think he's still with the club, he pulled me aside and said something that I'm gonna remember for the rest of my life. And he said, let me tell you a secret. He said, like, what? And he goes like, soccer players are the beings most similar to humans. And like it took me a few years to figure out what he wanted to say. And I think it's pretty much the Machiavellianism. So you do need to watch out. Like, you do need to watch out what you're saying, the feedback you're giving. And we all know that in professional sports there are, a lot of, I would say, like, crazy coaches and crazy athletes. So there's a lot of crazy coaches that gets the result. Like, if you check their methods and the loading, it's not scientific. Sometimes it's like weird, but they have this personality. They have this, ability to push the people that, they can trick them into working harder, or, they can trick them mentally, and they get the results. So, I would say that the example is just a warning that we cannot be so naive, thinking that, I like transparency, and I like, things to be, transparent and visible, and you can provide the whys behind the hows. But at the end of the day, athletes are beings very similar to humans. So we do need to take into account some of those tricky strategies of, withholding feedback, sometimes lying, but again, with the good intentions. So not with the bad intentions of exploiting, but at the end of the day, we are exploiting the athletes in terms of, they need to push on a given day and provide performance, but with the good intentions in mind, so they can give the best they have on a given day and so forth. So, and again, it was being a little bit provocative from my side, which I agree.
No, but it makes sense. I mean, I'm not personally comfortable lying to an athlete, but I definitely don't talk to an athlete like I would a colleague. I mean, in medicine, especially with in rehabilitation, like, the paradigm sort of initially was this more like biomechanical type model, and you'd hear therapists or physicians talk to patients, and like every single consultation was an anatomy and a biomechanics lesson, and that's, there's been some research showing that makes some athletes catastrophize and makes them neurotic. And now the paradigm is kind of shift more towards like the neurophysiological end of things. But at the same time, like athletes, they might not want to hear about pathoanatomics, but I don't know if it's any more comforting to hear about increased arousal levels in the amygdala and about their immune system being compromised and cortical smudging and all these things. So, you can explain something to somebody and not talk to them about like you would a colleague and still maintain some integrity. You're not lying, but I think it's like to your point, it's okay to have different ways of talking to different people and still maintain some semblance of transparency.
Yeah, but another example might be again feedback. So let's say you are prescribing intervals. So you can prescribe. Maybe you can again lie and say that the rest interval is like 1 minute and it's actually 50 seconds. Or you can give them, for example, if they don't have any tracking device, you can make them run laps, and then you can give them a wrong or actually, wrong or false times. So just to make them, run faster or push more. Or you can also cheat them, and you probably know that from a military. I think that the SAS unit was famous for that, for saying that, the end point is, 10 kilometers march, and just before you reach the end point, you can see the truck just, moving away. And, and then, someone might say, fuck it. And some people just like, let's go for, extra 5-mile walk. And, the truck is just behind the corner. So, just making sure that, they push it over the limit. So just making sure that, you kind of withhold some stuff, with the aim to, improve performance, improve adaptation.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to get into a philosophical conversation about what constitutes lying and what types of lying are justifiable, but I am all for exactly what you just talked about, where, if you're trying to cultivate certain psychological qualities and have athletes deal with uncertainty. I mean, I think that there is a place for deliberately deceiving athletes. I saw a talk that Steve Magnus gave about toughness, actually, and that's one of the things that he does is like he won't provide any feedback at all, or he'll provide the wrong feedback. And there's a deliberate objective in mind with that. It's not lying to deceive somebody for some kind of egotistical gain. So definitely, I think those are very very useful things. Now, obviously, the Prince is one sort of, even though it's tongue in cheek, one non-training related book that you've been influenced by. What are some other seemingly non-training related, more philosophy based books that have shaped your approach to preparation?
Oh, I think the Nassim Taleb Anti-Fragile, and I mentioned that on multiple times. And the other one was, I would say, Gerd Gigerenzer's books. And I think one of these latest was Risk Savvy. So those two, I would say, were the most influential on me philosophically. There might be some few more, but those two are the ones that immediately pop in my head.
What were the big takeaways from those two books?
Oh, so I think the main takeaway is this concept of Leonard Jimmy Savage idea of small worlds and a big world, or small and large worlds. And I think Gerd Gigerenzer is a little bit better in explaining that, while Nassim Taleb is better at bitching. So the idea is that we live in a complex world called the large world, and we use statistics and modeling to represent it as a map. So we create a map of the territory, and within that map, all the events, all the probabilities, and all this stuff is nominated. So we can get the probability distributions and likelihood and all this stuff. And with that small constrained world, we can find the optimal and best case scenarios. So that's pretty much the what Nassim Taleb called the curve, the line fitting. So we are let's take like a small scatter as an example. What you're trying to do when we fit the line, so the linear regression, we want to try to find the optimal line that minimize the total sum of errors, from between the line and the data points. So there's infinite number of lines, but there's, really, really small number that kind of minimize the error. But again, that's a small world. That's like a constrained, and in that small world, everything is nominated. So in that regard, we can figure out the best practices, the optimal stuff, and so forth. But and I think it started with Jimmy Leonard, is that he warns that we cannot just apply the small world ideas to a large world, because in a large world there's a lot of stuff the unknown unknowns, like we don't know how things gonna work in a large world. So I would say the main takeaways from both Nassim Taleb and Gerd Gigerenzer is this distinction between the small world and a large world. And Nassim Taleb is bitching because people assume that the large world is predictable as a small world. He called it, I think, turkey fallacy or something like that. And he called the people who intervene based on the small world models into large world, he calls them interventionistas, if memory serves me well.
Yeah.
So assuming that things will roll on as we predicted in a small world. And Gerd Gigerenzer is actually on the same side, but I think he explains it a little bit better than Nassim. So what he proposed, and there's a huge body of evidence on that, is that decision making in a small world is different than decision making in a large world. So for example, if you read Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that's quite similar.
Yep.
But the problem with thinking fast and slow and the critique of the Kahneman work is that they're all small world models. So what Gerd Gigerenzer is proposing, and he's actually defending, are the heuristics, are the maybe not optimal rules of thumb, like really simplified rules of thumb that seems to be not optimal in a small world problem or small world domain, but seems to be robust or seems to be performing really well in a large world where you cannot predict how things gonna evolve. So long story short, I think that the main concepts are the difference between small and large world and the way we make decisions in a small and large world domain, and they are different. As a potential problem down the road is this idea that all models are wrong.
Right.
So you might say, okay, this is a small world, it's based on this and that assumption, hence it's crap. But I don't think that's the case actually. So you probably know I'm a big fan of Nassim Taleb and Jordan Peterson, and I think this idea that everything is so relative, the relativism of the models of the science, is postmodernistic idea.
Sure.
So I'll give you a few examples. So let's imagine you want to check if training load is inducing injury or is associated with injuries. So first of all, we have these constructs: training load and injury. So we need to define those constructs as statistically. How do we measure it? So what data are we collecting? So you might collect GPS data, you might collect readiness, and you might collect also the injury data, like is it contact injury, is it non-contact injury, and so forth. And then you need to, from that large world that I mentioned before, large world, you need to kind of create a small world model, and then you create a statistical model and get inferences and associations and predictions and so forth. But then at the end of the day, you might say, like, this is all subjective, this is all crap, it doesn't make any sense, which like in a way I do agree with, because there's unlimited ways you can represent the complexities in the data, but I'm more in belief that this type of model needs to be predictive, like they need to have predictive validity. So they need to be usable in the large role in terms of making sure that we can predict what's going to happen when we intervene and so forth. So just because there's multiple models that we can use to represent the complex reality or the large world doesn't necessarily mean that all models are useless. So, there's probably a hierarchy of, what constitutes good modeling, what constitutes bad modeling. And in my mind, what constitutes good modeling is they are predictive. So they can predict either how things gonna evolve when you intervene or when you don't intervene, and they can also be predictive in terms of theory. So they can help you create additional theories that how the world works. So what we need to keep in mind is we shouldn't forget the distinction between the large and small world models, and we shouldn't assume that just because it's a small world it's useless.
Yeah.
So just to avoid this postmodernistic idea of nothing is real, everything is so relative.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think there's this false assumption that knowledge acquisition is this linear process. So if you're going to criticize models or previous models that you're going to say, well, those aren't as sophisticated as what we have now, you're assuming that you would have arrived at the point you're at now without those less sophisticated models. And if you're going to shun the previous models, then you should be shunning your sort of description of reality right now, because in 20 years, you're going to be bad-mouthing exactly what you're saying right now. So it's not a linear process. I think we have this standard where it's like, if we don't have things perfectly nailed right now, then the model or that explanatory process is worthless. But the only way that knowledge evolves is through continually deconstructing models and creating new ones. So it doesn't render the previous models useless. It's just they're not as refined as what you have right now. But I think in this sort of like pseudo-intellectual quest for perfection, I think we can be overly critical about modeling.
Oh yeah, sure. But also the thing that's worth mentioning is that I'm gonna quote George Box, famous statistician, saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah. And Nassim Taleb says, but some are harmful.
Sure.
But so the thing is, for example, that geocentric model was quite dominant in history, where we believe that the Earth is in the center of the universe, which is factually wrong. But that type of model also made us, and I think it's still being used somewhere, in terms of calculus. It make us be. It was useful for sailors and army to orient themselves based on the stars and positions and so forth. Although it's factually wrong.
Right.
So certain models doesn't need to be factually right to be still useful in practice. Sometimes I get in a war with say lab coats. They try to make everything so precise, but at the end of the day, there might be a certain, I would say, trade-off, as you mentioned, between the usefulness and precision. So when does things stop being useful and become too precise? So, yeah. And I think I like predictive analytics and machine learning. We call that overfit. So sometimes the model is really, really good at predicting stuff that's already happened. So we want to have a model that generalizes to new scenarios, so you can predict on unseen data. So some of the really complex models that are having really, really good performance on the data that's being used to train the model are really performing lousy on the unseen data, because they tend to jump to noise. So in machine learning, there are different techniques that kind of controls for this overfit, and I think it's quite connected to training as well in few particular ways, I think. So I like to study different things, and so far I've been useful, I guess, as someone who tries to connect the dots from different domains and try to bring them into a training field.
Yeah, and I've always, just having followed your work for a while, I've seen you as a connector, and your writing and your expertise covers a large bandwidth of micro and macro level concepts. Like, I know that you've written a book on interval training and periodization, but you also write and speak about things like heuristics and critical thinking and even science as a field. So do you have a systematic way that you learn or cultivate your ideas, or do you just kind of follow what interests you at the time? In other words, like, how do you decide when to zoom in and zoom out and sort of audit yourself as a coach?
I would say depending on the problem at hand. So
okay.
When I started working in Sweden as a strength conditioning coach in Hammarby, I hardly use Excel. Like I didn't know even how to use Excel. Like, that was 2011. And we started collecting data, and I started trying to plug that data into Excel. And funny enough, before that, I used to create tables and charts in Word. So I started using Excel, and then you see that you can do much more, different ways to analyze your data, and then you make these rookie mistakes of designing the database in a wrong way, and then down the road you figure out it's wrong, then you start all over again, and it's a painful process, but you get really experiential knowledge of how things work and how should you design stuff and so forth. But I think that's, I would say, one process, like trying to solve your own problems. You try to find the solutions from other domains and things like that, and then you dig a little bit deeper. And the other was just pure interest of in other domains. So sometimes I just take a book and read it from different domain, and then I figure out there's something to it. For example, one example that kind of changed or made me pivot a little bit in that direction was reading about the software development, the project management they are using, called the Agile or the Scrum methodology. And I saw a lot of potential of that type of reasoning to be implemented in our domain in performance. So, we as an industry, which is the word I don't like to use, like as a profession, coaching or strength conditioning is quite young. Although it's sports and competition are as old as the human beings. But we do think that we kind of we invented everything in our domain, but there's different domains that they have similar problems and they already have potential solutions. We just need to look for it. So, for example, the planning issues, they are quite common in pretty much any industry. The control, the management of people, and all that stuff. It is not unique to sport domain. So every other profession has similar issues, and we just need to look for potential solution and try to implement it in our own domain.
Yeah, and I've always noticed that you've tried to quantify your work and collect data, and you're always learning more about statistics, and not just flying by the seat of your pants. This whole this is what my eyes tell me, therefore this is what I'm going to do. You are trying to develop objective ways to sort of calibrate your coaching eye, but at the same time, I've seen you be very critical of scientism and blind faith and quantification, almost in a Talebian way, where I've seen some of your social media posts. So how do you reconcile your deep respect for statistics and modeling, with an appreciation for the uncertainty and the fluid decision making that's inherent to coaching?
So the example, the analogy of the small and large world that I just gave, I think it's really helpful in reconciling the two. So as mentioned before, all the statistical modeling and all this data collection are the small worlds. So they are simple representations of the complex reality that we need to implement decisions in. So I see. I see all this statistical modeling as a tool in your toolbox. So, for example, evidence-based, that's currently being a bastardized word, doesn't mean that you take the latest meta-analysis study, and then you implement it with your athletes. But it does mean that you need to look for certain sources of evidence. So there are multiple sources of evidence to help you out make a decision, or I would say make a educated guess what might be working with your athletes. And at the end of the day, you're still experimenting, but you don't start as a blank slate. So you do want to have some a priori knowledge in terms of what's being done so far, in terms of historically the best practices, the Lindy effect, as Nassim Taleb called it. So what are the training practices that are still there, that seems to be useful or at least not harmful. Then that's one source of the evidence. Then the other source of the evidence might be research papers. So, what the research is saying, and all this stuff, the research so far is mostly based on I would say, utilize the group-based statistics, like the averages and things like that. So, but again, that also gives you a certain type of evidence in terms of what you can expect. But I see it as an analogy of the wise king. So if you're a king, you're not going to make a decision yourself. So you wanna bring in certain advisors, and these will be the sources of the evidence in quotations. So one advisor will be what the data is saying. Other advisor is like what the research is saying. The third one will be what's being done historically, what the oppositions are doing. And the fourth and fifth and so forth could be, your own intuition. Because as stated previously, all the statistical models are the small world, and you're the one that needs to make a distinction and understand that you do need to apply that in a complex realities. And all these small world models doesn't take all these intricate, I think that's the right word, and complicated context and all this stuff that you can see as a person. And sometimes you cannot even see it. So I think that's how I reconcile it, like the evidence-based approach and data-driven decision making and so forth. I see it as a wise king. So you take advices from multiple advisors, but at the end of the day, you are making a decision, like educated guess, and you're gonna take the education or sources of evidence from multiple sources rather than a single source. And having said that, just because, for example, I critique certain statistical methods or certain research and so forth, for example, the research being the group-based mean averages and so forth, they are still useful. That's still one of the best guess we can have in terms of estimating how a certain individual is going to react. Again, we do need to keep into account that there's still going to be a huge variability in terms of response. So at the end of the day, we are trying to combine the evidence with experimentation. So I guess that's one of the rationale behind the, in quotation mark, the agile periodization framework that I've been developing over last few years.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's when you talk about statistics in that way, it just goes back to the modeling analogy that you used, where some of these statistics and these group-based metrics, it's not that they're useless, but it's just an attempt to explain reality, and to that degree, they're inherently wrong. But you can still look at some of those trends and then try to extrapolate them to the environment that you work in, or it's just data that helps to inform your decision. But ultimately, like you said, as the coach, you have to make the decision based on other forms of information and other models that are also inherently flawed. And I found your description of evidence-based practice very satisfying, because often I think it's a well-intentioned and necessary movement, but I think sometimes the people who are like the real cheerleaders for evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine sometimes undermine the movement with their tactics, because they can be very sort of puritanical and self-righteous. And I mean, by virtue of the fact that you're sort of suggesting, not you personally, but if somebody suggests that what they're doing is evidence-based, I think that takes on a sort of, again, puritanical and self-righteous quality that can rub people the wrong way, whereas there needs to be a certain amount of humility in any of this. And you said that you're effectively, no matter how much data you gather, you're just educated guessing, and the idea is to sort of be guessing in a more educated manner than other people. But at the end of the day, we're all still guessing, and we're extrapolating because the environment that we're working in is not identical to what occurs in a controlled trial or even in a different case study. So, there's the uncertainty there, but at the same time, I thought that your explanation of evidence-based practice was much more satisfying than what you might typically encounter from somebody who's more of a zealot for that movement.
Oh, yeah. So you gave a good example. For example, let's assume I coach you for or me or someone else coach you, or someone else coach you for a few years, and you get in a certain pattern of how a certain individual might react. But every time with a new individual, especially when they are breaking their personal best, or seasonal best, but I would say like personal best, they're entering the unknown domain. So they're never been there. Maybe when someone is coming back from, say, a layoff or injury, and then you pretty much know how certain, like I wouldn't say no, but you're more probable in knowing how certain individual might react to certain type of training or what their preferences and so forth. But for example, let's say I coach you for like 5 years, and then we continue with the same philosophy of training, and then we know, like for example, that certain type of training load is going to bring you a certain type of effect and so forth. But for example, last year you had a job promotion, you've been really making a lot of money, you have your girlfriend, you have your kid, and so forth. So the training effects will be, for example, different than, for example, next year. Maybe, you got divorced, your kid got sick, or, problems in school, you might losing your job and so forth. So the context will change.
Yeah.
The context will change, and, the study cannot take that into account. So, but as you said, is that you do need to take like the best evidence you have, but at the end of the day, you're still experimenting. Like we always have this Hume's gap, like Hume as a Scottish philosopher, the is and ought gap between what there is currently and what's going to happen based on intervention. And you're always making a guess. So even if I know you for like a years, I've been coaching you, the things are so different for you now that I'm making educated guess. And imagine you are breaking a world record. So you're entering not only your own unknown territory, you're entering the humanity unknown territory. You're breaking, like going under, like say 9.6 something, or even more for a like 100-meter dash. So you're entering the completely unknown territory, and all the models so far are based on I'm gonna bitch a little bit. They're based on grade motivated students that they're running 11.2 or something like that. So at the end of the day, you want to collect as much as a priori knowledge you can gain to give you some confidence, and then you're still gonna experiment. So you still want to do this plan, do, check, act, or OODA loop, or how you call it in the military. Yeah. You still want to experiment how some going to react. And the funny thing, coming back to Nassim and coming back to Gergi Gerenzer, there's a huge body of evidence showing that decision making when you're still experimenting, some type of certain types of decision making, or certain type of I would say asset allocation or something like that, in terms of how I'm going to distribute certain assets, can be a bit more robust than different ways. So even if when you're experimenting, you want to make sure that you as Nassim Taleb is calling it, protect from the downside. So protect from the effects that if you are wrong, and pursuing the upside. So trying to make sure that if you are right, you're going to be really right. You're going to get the big effects. So coming back to the takeaways from Nassim Taleb is this idea of the barbell strategy. Like you need to juggle between two extremes. So even if you're experimenting, even if you are, using the best a priori evidence-based knowledge, you still have these two complementary components in decision making. So one is protecting from the downside, or the barbell strategy, and one is, reaping the effects of the upside. So, when you're creating the experiment, and at the end of the day, we are all experimenting when we design a training intervention, you want to make sure to have these two components in place. So one is protecting from the downside, and that could be applied in numerous ways. So actually, that can mean numerous things. So it can mean that, I don't want to be really innovative, so I can, I create a really, really novel stimuli for the athletes so they can risk the injury, or I can, really push them over the limit so they can, break and, get overuse injuries or burn out and things like that. So I want to protect from that. And the other side of the barbell is just making sure that, I'm not only doing the bossable skips and things like that. So I do want to kind of push them a little bit further forward in the adaptation. So again, long story short is that the two takeaways from Nassim Taleb and Gerd Gigerenzer is, how should we, like, even when we have the a priori knowledge and evidence-based stuff, how should we design the experiments? How should we make decisions in the uncertain domain? Like when we don't know how things gonna evolve. So, and I think those two guys are the most influential in my recent, I would say, changes in, looking at the planning and periodization.
Yeah, you've referenced a couple of authors who have written pretty extensively about prediction. So what are your thoughts on the fascination with the injury prevention phenomenon? Like, do you even think that we're asking the right question there? And then how do you think that ties in with some of the concepts that you've written about in terms of the different types of, like explanatory and predictive modeling?
I think that, pursuing the injury prevention is a like really, really good goal, especially in the high level sports. So that would be the protect from the downside. So, for example, if you're working with the high level soccer athletes, they're already high level. So one of the main goals of the strength conditioning coach will be to, don't kill them. So make them available for the head coach and make them available for the practices and the games. And, one way to do that is to minimize the risk of getting injured. But what be missing is that this idea that we can create the optimal training load and the idea of the optimality, optimal progressions and optimal, testing and optimal, drill design, optimal exercise selection, optimal, intensity zones and so forth based on the individual, based on the testing. And again, I think they are all, viable strategies that we need to consult. But again, at the end of the day, they're all small world ideas. From a large world perspective, the best, and you know it pretty much better than me, is to be prepared. So to be prepared for certain extreme scenarios rather than trying to find the optimal stuff. So not sure that answers the first part of the question.
It does, yeah.
And I think we all fell into this idea of let me try to find the English word, is the risk-averse strategy, or pretending we are doing something and we are not doing anything, or, it looks like training, but it's not actually risking anything. So because it's not risking anything, you actually are not pushing athletes further forward. So let's take European soccer as an example. So they go in the gym, they're pretty much lifting in quotation mark, but they're just fucking around in the gym. So, no one's going to get injured lifting, but, they're not going to progress in strength and so forth. So we do need to keep in mind that we can become risk averse, in terms of load and, and again, that could be sprinting, that could be contact drills and so forth. And I think the other question you asked me is that the difference between prediction and explanation.
Yes.
And currently that's a hot topic in statistics, and it has been a hot topic over last decades and so forth. And we cannot make a distinction between the two. We do need to have both to complement each other. So I'll give you an example of what's the explanation, what's the prediction. So imagine you are a king and you want to make you want to feed your tribe or whatever, and you want to figure out what's the connection between raining and maybe a rain dance. Does the rain dance cause raining? So you want to make sure that figure out is there's a causal link, because if you have rain, the crops will be growing faster and so forth. So that's an explanation problem. So the king might be interested in what's causing the rain. How can I intervene so there's going to be more rain? So that's a causal or explanatory question. And then on the flip side, you might have a queen, and she needs to decide should she take an umbrella or not. So the question that she might be interested in might be checking the clouds and checking the weather prognosis and seeing is it going to rain or not? So should I take the umbrella or not? So that's a predictive question. And again, they are both complementary because assuming you have a causal link between A and B, that also implies that you'll be able to predict what's going to happen. And again, there's a big discussion between these two concepts. And I highly suggest reading the book by Judea Pearl called The Book of Why. It's been published this year, I think. And he's critiquing a little bit this, latest, big data, machine learning and artificial intelligence, critiquing that movement that it doesn't tell us, how the, intervention is going to work and so forth. So there's a big tug of war in statistics and theory of science and, things like that regarding the difference between causal analysis or the explanatory and predictive analysis. But again, long story short, in most of the sciences and social sciences as well as particularly in our like sports science, we've been dominated by this idea of the explanatory. So, but even with the explanatory, there might be different subtypes. So, for example, it could be only association. So that's one of the Judea Pearl calls it the rungs of the causal analysis. The first one is association, second one is intervention, and third one is counterfactuals. So, for example, in injury prediction, again, quotation mark, injury prediction research, what they found is the association. So, for example, they found that the increase in training load is associated with injuries. And then you say, oh, that's great, it's associated. But statistically it can mean a lot of things. So it might mean that there's a statistically significant association, but what they haven't provided is the prediction. So, okay, if there's association, can I actually predict if someone's going to get injured and in how precise I'm going to be in predicting? So the general idea is that, we do need to have both. And I would say, unfortunately, we've been dominated. Most of the sciences and most of the, social sciences, especially the sports science, have been dominated by this, association-based statistics. And I think there's one of the reasons for the gap between the lab coats and the coaches are the different questions that they're imposing. So, for example, in statistics now, in sports statistics, we have this currently the hot debate regarding the magnitude-based inferences. I don't know if you're familiar with that, with the Will Hopkins stuff.
Okay.
So, magnitude-based inference gives you the prediction to a population, but it also takes into account the magnitude. So, if the effect is trivial, beneficial, or meaningful, and MBIs can give you, for example, the statement that the treatment is very likely beneficial, or it can actually give you a percentage. So it can say the probabilities. It can say that 60% the effect in population is beneficial, 30% is trivial, and 10% is harmful. So there's a hot debate if this is actually a valid method of making inferences to a population and so forth. But I don't think at the end of the day, I don't think it helps the coach or practitioner because they have different question at hand. So they might be interested. Okay, what's the probability that a particular individual will respond, beneficially, trivially, or harmfully? So you cannot take MBIs, like magnitude-based inferences, to make a prediction how a random individual is going to respond. So I think that, we do need to supplement all these, association-based statistics as a first rung of the explanatory or causal analysis with the prediction. So we want to say, like, okay, if this is really true, if this is a causal mechanism, can we actually predict what's going to happen? But the thing is also, we cannot only rely on one side. So I already alluded to the problems of if you're only using association statistics, but on the other hand, if you're only using prediction statistics, then you might look at the, for example, numbers, and then you can conclude that, playing basketball makes you tall. So that's pretty much the prediction. And we do need to have both. And as a scientist, we do need to take into account the way that the practitioners are reasoning and using probabilities. So I'm hoping to answer your question. I don't know if I went off.
You definitely did.
So we are, my colleague and mine, Ivan Jukic, we are working on a paper. So this is what we went into in a really complex domain. We are trying to get our head out of it. So we this year, actually 2018, we collected data for my PhD for velocity-based training, and I implemented a little bit more novel statistics. So we started writing a first paper, and then we figured out, oh shit, we implemented really new statistics. So we decided, okay, we're going to write a paper about the statistics we used, and I actually wrote a package in R and so forth. So we started writing this paper, and actually the topic of the paper is the difference between explanatory and predictive, and actually providing few ideas and techniques for the researchers to provide the predictive estimates that are actually really understandable by the coaches. So, and we started writing this, and it reached out to have like 100 pages with the graphs and code and all this stuff. So I'm hoping to finish that monster soon, and I think it's going to make what I'm saying a little bit more clear, hopefully.
Okay, yeah, because often coaches criticize researchers for saying that they don't have enough skin in the game. They're not actually working with the athletes. But I think an equally fair criticism, in the reverse direction, is that coaches don't understand statistics enough. So are there any resources that you think are good for coaches to learn at least just like a foundational level of statistics? Because even professional researchers, right, like they're criticized all the time for using the quote unquote wrong metrics, wrong statistics. And if even professionals are making some of these mistakes and being criticized, is it realistic to expect a coach or somebody without a PhD to be able to understand this stuff? Because it's literally like learning a new language. You're trying to utilize mathematics essentially to describe a phenomenon that you would normally describe with your mouth or look at with your eyes. So, are there, just like easily digestible resources that coaches can read, or do you really have to go deep into like the almost PhD level to understand this stuff?
First of all, I think that the burden is on the researchers in terms of providing the estimates that the coaches can understand. And actually, Gerd Gigerenzer in that book in Risk Savvy provides few techniques. So, for example, if I tell you he gives an example of, for example, the probability of raining today is like 70%. So then you can say, like, what does it mean? So what does it mean 70%? So it's gonna rain at 70% of the area. Is it gonna rain, with the 70% of the magnitude? Or like, what does 70 mean? So, and similar thing is with the p-values and effect size and so forth. So there are different estimates that are more understandable to people, and most of these techniques involve not probabilities but counting and making graphs that pinpoints to the a counting or dots and things like that. So Gerd Gigerenzer actually provides few interesting things there. One example is stating that, for example, drinking this supplement increased the risk of getting, say, a cancer by 1,000%. And then you're like, oh shit. But if you look at the not relative probabilities but the absolute probabilities, or actually counting, you might say that 1 in 10 millions get the cancer, and when someone is drinking a supplement, 10 in 10 million gets the cancer.
Right.
So it's like really, really low probability. But if you express it as a relative probability, then you get like 1,000% or something like that.
Okay.
So Gergi Gerenz is actually pointing to that and to this gap. Also, one example, and again, this is all been discussed for ages, is using the language that actually practitioners understand. So sometimes actually not sometimes, but most of the times, even the PhDs and well published researchers don't understand what the p-value mean. Like what's a p-value? It's like even if they don't understand, imagine how it is to a day-to-day coach.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So I think it's up to the researchers to provide the uncertainty estimates that are understandable to coaches. And there are different techniques, like visualization techniques that could be understandable to common people. I can give you a few links if you're interested in that. So, and one suggestion, for example, you probably know what the Cohen's d effect size is the comparing the groups. And then if you say someone the Cohen's d is like 0.2 or 1, what does it mean? Like, is it good or bad? So I think we do need to create a language, like probability language that that average coach can understand. And as I said already, there are a few things that are being already implemented. And with our paper, we are trying to provide extra few metrics or extra few estimates that we believe will be easier to understand for the coaches. And one of the common used estimates is something that's called the common language effect size, or CLES. So, for example, if you're comparing two groups of, it could be like, say, junior or senior, the common language effect size tells you how likely is that the random person from group A is higher than a random person from group B. So that's something that's much easier to comprehend and understand by someone without the statistical knowledge. So to answer your question, the first part is that I think the researcher should be doing a better job in visualizing the uncertainties, so the practitioners can actually understand it. As I already said, MBI, the magnitude-based inferences, they are a major step forward in terms of taking a magnitude into account. But if I tell you, if you're a coach and I'm a researcher, if I tell you that, for example, this intervention have 60% of chance to be beneficial. So then you say, what does 60% mean? It's like, does it mean that 60% of my athletes will have a beneficial effect or not? So you can have multiple ways to understand that 60%. And it actually means that if I replicate this study, say 100 times, the mean effect, the average group effect, will be beneficial in 60 replications. So try to explain that to a coach.
Right.
So it's really hard. So what we are trying to propose in this paper we are trying to finish is to use more common language probabilities. So in this case, like, what's the probability of my athletes having the beneficial response? So that gives you more, I would say, more real world actionable estimates. So what's going to happen to a random individual. And when it comes to recommendation of the books, I think the Risk Savvy book by Gergi Gerenz is really, really good read for everyone interested in probabilities and all this stuff. When it comes to learning statistics and modeling in general, there's a great course on Coursera which is free. It's a course called I think model thinking, and there's recently a book. I think it's been published just a few days ago by Scott Page. It's the book that follows up that course. It's called Model Thinker. Okay. So this book is outstanding because it gives you it's like a zoo of the models. So it gives you all the best models that are currently used in science, and you can apply to your own domain. And one of those models, again, is a linear regression, which is quite common in statistics. But I think that the best way would be to approach things from both top down and bottom up. So bottom up will be try to solve your own questions, like try to solve your own problems. That's the best way to learn. So, when you have questions, try to answer them, try to, do an analysis yourself. And I think that's the best way to gain the experiential knowledge. And the top down will be, have a big picture. And this analogy of the small world and the large world is like, it was a groundbreaking for me. It's like, okay, this is what it is. So just understanding where things fit in a big picture is really helpful. But at the end of the day, you still need to, get your hands dirty by, doing analysis yourself. So long story short, I would highly recommend the Gerd Gigerenzer book, Risk Savvy. And there are maybe, I think, extra few books by him. And the Model Thinker by Scott Page. So those are two I will highly recommend for someone starting. Like additional book that's really useful, especially because it uses the Excel to teach. Although the Excel is not the best tool, but it's really good to get the sense of the data and the sense of the analysis being performed. Is a book called I think it's called the Data Smart Foreman or something like that. I think it's like from 2013, 2014. It's also great book. So these are the 3 books that I will, highly recommend.
Okay, great. I'll put links to those books in the notes. So you've been really generous with your time. Where can people learn more about the work that you do and some of the projects that you're involved with now?
So yeah, we have a website, complementarytraining.net. The website is running since 2010 as a blog, and from 2014 as a membership site. Although most 60-70% of the content is free. We are also finishing the software called Athlete SR, which is a software for scheduling and survey and analytics, which you can check. You can test it out. Although the final version, I would say that the roundup of the software will be available around in February 2019. So in maybe 2 or 3 months. And on Twitter, I think I'm the most active on Twitter as a physical_prep, as a physical preparation. So you can find out more there, as well as the Facebook page, the complementary training page.
All right, very cool. Well, good luck with the rest of your PhD. I look forward to reading the finished product whenever that happens.
Oh, I'm looking forward to get that chip off my shoulder. I don't know if you say that.
Yeah.
Thanks
you're looking forward to it more than I am, I'm sure.
Sure thing. Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks again. Take care. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's podcast in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.